Ecological economics, a developing discipline that seeks to integrate ecology and economics, hopes to address some of the world's most pressing problems, so that human cultures can develop and prosper without destroying the Earth's life support system upon which we all depend. Presently, the ideas and theories of standard economics that guide global trade and commerce and inform many political decisions are conceived as isolated circular flows of exchanges between producers and consumers. The current problems associated with resource exhaustion, overpopulation, and pollution cannot exist in this model. The economy as represented here does not simply depend upon a physical environment, but rather upon the continuous flow of income, which is, in theory, boundless. Ecological economics distinguishes itself from conventional economics in the broad and comprehensive view that it takes. In ecological economics, the human economy in its physical dimensions is seen as an open subsystem of a finite, non-growing, and materially closed ecosystem. As the scope and severity of the ecological crisis intensifies, we must begin to reintegrate our economy with the very real laws and limitations of the natural world. We must, both in theory and in practice, begin to invest in and value the air, water, soil, trees, and creatures big and small upon which our lives truly depend. In short, we must invest in our natural capital assets.
Up to 1930, maybe, it was very clear, except in local places, that humanity was not affecting structure. From about 1930 on, it became apparent that humanity was affecting structure on a planetary scale. The evidence is there in the CO2 trace and so on and so forth. Once you demonstrate that this organism called humanity is affecting structure, then there is no alternative left, but humanity has to begin to control. There is no, it would be lovely if that wasn't true. But we have to, we can no longer be children of nature. We have no retreat.
In this whole issue of sustainability, there are many items that are still very uncertain. And one of the most uncertain is what precisely are the implications for humanity of extinguishing perhaps half, perhaps three-quarters of the other species on the planet. The only honest answer to that is that we don't know. And I would suggest that rather than using that as an excuse to trying it and finding out, the intelligent and rational response is to say that if we don't know something, we don't do it until we do know a little more about what's involved, and we can be quite sure that the results are not going to be catastrophic. And I'm pleased to say that through something called the precautionary principle, which all the governments who were at the UNCED conference decided that they approved of and which they put their pens to, the precautionary principle says just that when we are uncertain about something, we are cautious and we do not take risks which may turn out to have very, very large costs indeed.
A system is resilient if it is capable of adjusting positively to exogenous shock. If it is capable of responding in a way which preserves the self-organization of that system. Now, that notion of resilience seems to me to apply very nicely to economic systems. If an economic system is capable of meeting the various challenges posed by the environment, then there's a very good chance that it's going to be sustainable, and there's a very good chance that the productive potential of the asset base itself will be maintained. And that's what preserving the value of the asset base requires. It requires preserving the productive potential of the asset base.
Economics, as far as I understand, is a science where you learn to economize with what you have. So what's really a difference between ecological economy and economics and usual economics?
We always economize on what is the scarce factor. And now the scarce factor is more and more natural capital. It used to be man-made capital, and natural capital was superabundant. Now, as a result of the growth of the human subsystem within the overall ecological system, we've changed the pattern of scarcity. Remaining natural capital is now the limiting factor. It's more scarce than human capital, than man-made capital. So fish catch is limited by the remaining populations of fish in the sea, not by the number of fishing boats. So we have to begin to economize on natural capital. And this is really what ecological economics is doing. It's calling attention, forcing attention to this changed pattern of scarcity. And so the object of our economizing now has to be remaining natural capital. Standard economics has been, its whole idea of value has been almost totally rooted in very individualistic assumptions. And so part of it is expanding out to a more community-based notion of value.
And the market system doesn't work anymore.
Well, it works, but it has a very restricted area within which it works. It's very good for allocating resources among alternative uses among individuals with given income distribution and so on. But it's not much good for setting the scale of the total human economy relative to the ecosystem which contains it.
Okay. Oh, these look much nicer than on the other side. You can see there are very little epiphytes on them, very little filamentous algae. And if you shake them, you will find lots of animals inside.
It's not just a matter that we would like to be able to value natural systems such as fish, but the economy itself depends on those, and it will collapse without those inputs. It will collapse without the existence of fish and clean water and forests and the ability to clean up waste that come out of the economy. So since we don't value it, since there isn't any way to, in the market system, to value it, it gets used up, and before you've reached a critical point, you may have lost the resource that in fact is supporting the economy.
Since this is the only large algae in the Baltic and it's so large diversity of species in here, it's also very important as a foraging area for fish and as a spawning and recruitment area. And of course, if this single system is a very important part of the Baltic ecosystem, if that would disappear for some reason, of course also all its importance for the fisheries would disappear, and probably it would mean a great economic loss to the Baltic if the bladderwrack disappeared. 'Cause
What about the possibility of calculating carrying capacity per capita for the entire planet and so the different regions and so? Is that already possible to give us a number in any unit, for instance, dollars or joules or whatever?
Well, I could say, I think the unit for calculating carrying capacity is probably total resource throughput, or the total volume of resources taken from the natural system, run through the economy, and then thrown back into the natural system as pollution. So how big can that be? And that's a product of two things. It's a product of population times per capita resource use. So we can, there are two variables to operate on: population and per capita resource consumption. Both of those have to be adjusted in order to get down to and stay within some notion of carrying capacity. Exactly what carrying capacity is an area, I think, of extremely important research, principally for ecologists. And in our little organization, there's a certain amount of good-natured needling between economists and ecologists. The ecologists constantly remind the economists of their shortcomings, and the economists do the same. And one of the things the economists remind the ecologists of is that we really do need better estimates of this idea of carrying capacity.
We have 5.5 billion people on the planet, and that population at current rates of growth will double within 35 to 40 years. And the question is, how are we going to feed an additional 3 or 4 or 5 billion people? Throughout the last 7,000 or 8,000 years, until the middle of this past century, we fed an increasing population by simply cultivating more lands. We cut down more trees, we can mow down prairie grass, convert it to agricultural land, and we simply expanded the amount of acreage under cultivation. Well, that option is no longer available for the human race on a global scale. Since at least the middle of the century, the way in which we've increased food production is by intensifying food production per hectare. And the most fundamental aspect of that intensification process is the fact that it requires more energy. And it particularly uses more fossil fuel. And the very basis of the revolution in agriculture that we've seen in the last 30 or 40 years, which we often heard referred to as the Green Revolution, is really another aspect of the Industrial Revolution of the last 150 years, that is learning how to use fossil fuels more cleverly to do various tasks. In this case, grow more wheat or more maize or whatever the crop may be. And wherever we look across the world, both in the industrial world, in Western Europe, Japan, North America, the high rates of production and food exports are very closely tied with increases in the amount of fossil fuels used. And this is fuel that's not only used to run the tractors, diesel fuel, but it's also oil and gas that's extracted and run through oil refineries to produce fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides and insecticides and all the other chemicals that are necessary to support these high-yield variety of crops. So every country we've looked at India and Costa Rica and Zimbabwe and Brazil, and across all of the tropical part of the world, we see the same trends that we've seen in North America and in Western Europe, only it's displaced about 50 years in time. That is an increasing amount use of fossil fuels to grow food. Now, the Green Revolution, again, it's a bit of a misnomer, because people tend to think that what we've done is genetically engineer plants somehow to convert sunlight into plant material, food, with greater efficiency. That's false. Genetic engineering has not altered the basic efficiency with which plants convert sunlight into plant biomass. What we've done is, with fossil fuels, is to remove some of the limiting factors that limit plant production, such as lack of water or nitrogen or phosphorus or some other nutrient. And when humans supply those nutrients or limiting factors, and we pump irrigation water out of the ground, or we convert oil into nitrogen, that enables the plants to convert more of the sunlight into edible portions of the plant, seeds, grains, etc. That's what the Green Revolution is all about. I think that the pressure in developing nations, because of population pressure in some nations, such as India and some African and Central American nations, the pressure is clearly on intensification, and aspects, people aren't thinking that much about organic farming and reducing inputs and worrying about soil erosion. It's starting. We see programs in India that are starting to deal with soil erosion, for example. But really, the problems of poverty and hunger in some of these nations are really the overriding factors. And right now, these governments, and many of the governments and the people see intensification as the only way to meet these problems. There is simply no way that I can imagine, even with low input agriculture, that we are going to be able to feed 10 or 11 billion people on this planet without having the specter of large-scale famine and human suffering with it. I think that is absolutely fundamental, that population growth, both in the developing nations and in the developed nations that who per capita have a much larger impact, must reduce their numbers. Absolutely essential.
Now, if we think of world trade, two phenomena, urbanization and trade itself, tend to distance people from the effects of their own consumption. There's both a spatial distancing in urbanization and a psychological distancing through trade. People become unaware of their connectedness to the rest of reality. Okay? There are two important effects of this. If we feel we can always import from elsewhere, it reduces the incentive to invest in the maintenance of our own natural capital assets. So that, for example, around the world, urbanization is destroying local farmland on the assumption we can always import from elsewhere. But the displacement of our consumption also blinds us to the external effects of that consumption, so that much consumption in the north is causing dire ecological consequences in the south, of which the consuming populations remain unaware. But the reality is that the development path of the rich industrial countries has depended to a very large extent on the exploitation, indeed the liquidation of our own natural capital assets, followed by the exploitation and partial liquidation of natural capital in much of the rest of the world through the colonial period, the depletion of forests and a whole array of other things. At the present time, the structure of the global economy through instruments of trade such as the GATT allows that process to continue. We get the product of many of their natural capital assets, forests, fisheries, and agricultural land. Half of the agricultural land in the third world is dedicated now to sustaining northern populations in luxury crops. This precludes the use in the third world of those same natural capital assets for self-development. We get the product, and through the structure of the international economy, much of the financial capital that results from the liquidation of those assets also returns northward in the form of debt repayment. So we really have a dilemma here, captured, I think, by both the malfunction of the economic model, in that it forces the net transfer of wealth from south to north, and in the ecological reality that is hidden from the economic analysis altogether. Marginal analysis shows us nothing about the total required quantities of natural capital, the amount that remains, or its allocation or misallocation around the planet. Righting this situation requires reinvestment so that we can begin to live more on the asset base that we have, allowing other people to benefit from the natural capital assets within their own territory. It doesn't abolish trade, but it changes greatly the nature of trade so that it only can be based on ecological surpluses rather than purely demand-driven liquidation of capital assets. It's a completely different way of looking at the trade picture.
If you look at the last period of, say, the last 40 years, you see a period of very rapid expansion in global consumption, very rapid expansion in resource use, quadrupling in use of energy, tripling in agricultural production, increased energy and chemical intensivity of agriculture. All of that has taken place in an essentially global free trade environment. Now, this was the actual objective of the promoters of free trade back in the 1940s. They didn't have environmental considerations on their minds. What they were aiming to do was to promote a stable basis for the expansion of industrial production throughout, especially what we now consider the developed world, and to a secondary degree in the developing nations. And in fact, the institutions of global free trade under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade have been enormously successful in promoting that, but that means they have also been enormously successful in promoting the very rapid use of natural resources, the more rapid throughput, as Herman Daly calls it, of natural resources through the economic system, and therefore the faster generation of wastes, pollution, increased carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, etc. If you look ahead to the next 40 years, I think it becomes evident that you can't conceive of the institutions of free trade as providing the basis for a globally sustainable economy for those 40 years. You can't conceive of a further quadrupling in GNP production, further quadrupling in energy use, another doubling of population accompanied by a tripling of agricultural production, that these projections simply don't compute when you look at the global resource base. And the concept of, in quotes, free trade, I think has to be rejected. That free trade is really an ideological construct. And in fact, what we've always had in the world is not free trade, but forms of strategic trade. That what has passed as a free trade regime since the 1940s has really been a strategic trade regime devised mainly by the United States. And within that regime, we've had successful strategic trade policies pursued by Japan, by some of the newly industrializing countries. The formation of the EEC itself is a strategic trade idea conceived in the 1950s by Jean Monnet. And the developing nations have tried with limited success to push their own strategic approach to trade. So there's always a strong strategic element in a trade agreement. And I think that needs to be explicitly recognized and turned to the advantage of the goal of sustainability and environmental protection. Now, this means there have to be certain basic guidelines for any trade agreement. One primary guideline is that every nation retains the absolute right to protect their own environment, conserve their own resources, and that overrides any considerations of freedom of trade per se. A second conclusion is that you need to have global institutions or regional institutions, depending on what the relevant trading area is, for environmental protection and conservation, for transfer of environmentally clean technology, that the goals which now are pursued by the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the IMF, the World Bank, have to be replaced by primary goals of environmental ecological sustainability. And only when that is done does trade become healthy.
How, for instance, could ecological economics deal with the problem with ever-growing motorism? Especially when you talk about the human rights of having your own car and going to the developing country, including the former Soviet Union. Yeah. I mean, it's hundreds of millions of new cars that should be built, and how could you prevent that if it now is necessary?
The point is that the real cost of operating a car is much higher than the cost that individuals are paying because of the long-term ecological damages of collective releases of CO2 and depletion of resources to make the cars. So one way of communicating that fact to the individuals is through taxing that depletion of resources that go into making the car. It makes the cars more expensive. It makes people then, when they're faced with the decision of do I buy a much more expensive car or do I use mass transit or some alternative method that's less costly in real terms, they'll make the decision to not buy the car, or at least more of them will.
But how can you do that? With which
politically, how can you do that?
Yes, how can you do that politically? In the whole society of the globe.
Well, let's see. Herman, you want to try that?
Yeah, you're going to pass that to me. I don't know how you do that with the whole society, the globe. We don't have any global institutions for passing global laws, so it has to begin at least at the national level, maybe even at subnational levels. In Los Angeles, they're already talking about limiting cars, limiting or putting a quantitative limit on the amount of gasoline, because it'll be necessary for people to do that in order to be able to breathe. And so they figure that breathing is more important than driving a car. And so when you get to that level, then the public is going to be willing to face up to the question. But I agree that at a global level, we can't do much of anything. I think we have to start at national level and then through federation work up to world level.
But it also might be possible to, at the boundaries of the national level, particularly if you're talking about large countries or large trading blocs like the EC or the United States, that if we decided to implement some of these policies internally, we could change the basis really of the tariffs that we charge at the boundaries to our countries, and say that instead of basing tariffs on trying to protect internal private interest from external private interests, which is what we've been using tariffs for, we could say that tariffs are designed to protect global common interests from local and global private interests, and set up a system of ecological tariffs that would be where you could charge the ecological costs of producing the product outside your country. In an equivalent way, it would have to be fairly imposed both internally and externally to qualify under the things like the GATT agreement. But if it is fairly applied to both internally produced and externally produced products, then it's possible to do that, and that would give an incentive for producers outside the country to reduce their ecological damage in the process of producing their products, and cars would be one thing that would fit into that, and give them an incentive to do things that are more sustainable in order to not be subject to the tariffs.
I would like to comment something that the finance minister of Mexico said when addressing these free trade talks between Canada, United States, and Mexico. Said, well, what we want is to export goods and not export people. And I think it's a good message for those opposing free trade as an ecological sound practice. This drives me to a question I want to address the members of the panel is, what do you think the demand for biodiversity products, commercial biodiversity products, makes? Because on the one hand, people say, if you demand tropical hardwood, the forests are going to disappear. But on the other hand, it says that if you demand, let's say, meat for burgers or grain to grow cattle for making burgers in your own country, then if someone has a plot of land, a peasant or a rich landowner, he would devote his land for growing cattle instead of growing wood. And if people are demanding tropical hardwoods all over the world, then you're going to grow tropical hardwoods instead of growing cattle. And I think it's an issue that hasn't been resolved. And it's a very important point, those green protectionists that argue that free trade shouldn't exist with environmental considerations rely on very heavily. They say, no, we don't want free trade because if we demand your products, you're going to finish up your resources, and we don't want you to do that. And I would like to hear your opinion of everyone, please.
If you have a resource which has no well-defined right, I'm not talking about private property rights, it may be communal property rights, but if it's not a well-defined right so that anyone can run in, grab the resource, and destroy it. Or if the government doesn't respect property rights and just order that this resource, this particular forest, should be used for the provision of wood for the local pulp plant, then we have a problem. And unless we fix those problems, we'll never be able to solve the problem of managing the resources efficiently.
You may be forgetting that defining property rights and forcing compliance is also a cost-benefit decision. I mean, and it means that the benefits of defining property rights or internalizing externalities may not be so big for let's say, for a certain country with a certain income level, while for another country, much richer country, those externalities should be internalized. Why move the decision center? Why use green protectionism in order to impose a certain definition and enforcement?
I say, if you cannot domestically internalize the externalities, if you cannot define and enforce property rights, which would support an efficient, sustainable use of the resource base, then a second best solution may be for the country, not for the external world, but for the country itself, to impose some controls of trade. Now, if you look at the problem from the point of view of the external world, I didn't do that, but let's look at that. It may very well be that Paul Ehrlich and I are quite interested in maintaining the tropical forests, but if we are have that desire, we also should, as was pointed out to us a couple of days ago, put our money where our mouth is. That is, we have to then to buy that kind of preservation. It's kind of new trade in a new commodity. The new commodity is preservation. Let's open up market for trade in those commodities.
Paul? No, I just wanted to make sure that the position I took before is clear. In the work we were doing looking at the Mexican situation, there was no question at all that going all the way back to Poinsett on U.S. monkeying around had set up a system in which the barriers were all the wrong way, and we were actually discouraging all sorts of things in Mexico, which would have helped keep jobs in Mexico if your desire is to keep Mexicans out of the United States, which is another issue and is not necessarily mine. So regardless of the green issue, there's no question, as we actually said in the book, it's a foreign policy issue for the United States. It's really a tough one, and one that the United States has insanely. We have debates in our Congress about migration policy without any debate about population policy, which is sort of like telling the airplane designer that you want an airplane that you can load 50 people a minute onto. When he says to you, well, but how many should it fly with? Say, don't bother me with those details. We just want to be able to load 50 people a minute.
The problem is, of course, that we have already so many people on Earth, and the number of people will probably double in the next 30, 40 years. So, and this is nothing you can really stop, I think, even if you try all the measures that would be available from an ethical point of view. I mean, this is something that is going to happen because many of the mothers to come have already been born. So that's a problem. One of the reasons, I think, why we have not been able to realize this early enough is that we have been able to compensate all the drawbacks from living above the carrying capacity. We have been able to compensate that by all the fossil fuels that we could invest in agriculture, for instance, and increase the production to a level which is actually not the natural carrying capacity. And that makes it so difficult for us to realize what it actually would be without these extra inputs. And we have to use a lot of our ingenuity to try to improve the natural carrying capacity with new technologies, I think. A better use of the natural resources is to self-organize in a way that we can keep on, even if the population increases to what has been predicted.
We need to begin to redirect the work of the national labs to think about technology and to put emphasis on technology for sustainability, to identify, design, and develop technologies for use in both the developed and underdeveloped world. We spend something like $20 billion a year in the national labs, where we have a lot of tremendous researchers. Just under half of that is spent at the DOE labs, the multi-program labs that do most of the weapons work. Now, not to tap into that resource, not to tap into the national labs as a way to redirect our technological capability seems to me to be a very serious misallocation of resources. And that's really the challenge, it seems to me, here today, to begin to talk about and get people involved, especially the technical workforce, in thinking about that shift to sustainable systems, shifting the focus of that resource use, of that the brains, the labor, the capital, the facilities, the money, all of it, to thinking about and developing systems around the world for sustainability. I was reading in a magazine an interview not long ago with the commander of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. His name is Henry Hatch. And this is a quote from that interview. I'm working toward, this is really unbelievable if you know the Corps of Engineers. I am working toward changing the direction of the Corps to embrace sustainable development. The Corps must begin to think of itself as the Corps of Environmental Engineers and give new meaning to the green of Army uniforms. Engineers, he says, are required to move us towards sustainable development. Now, I think he means that, on the other hand, they are trying to find a mission for that agency. My point is, we need to think about all of these resources that people don't, we're not going to stop spending money, that need to be redirected, and we need to convert those resources to the sustainability movement, part of which includes an enormous a focus on technology that we haven't paid any attention to.
We are all guilty of allowing conventional economics to become the language of politics, a language without a moral sense and with a limited relevance to real economic circumstances. In the process, I think we have ignored ethics and values. Yes, conventional economics does have an ethic, the devil take the hindmost. But it is politics, not economics, that must reflect what we value in society. And it is a new politics, and I would argue a new economics, that must serve as the bridge between economy and environment, between people and nature. Sustainability, I would argue, without equity is not sustainability. That can be argued in political terms, that equity leads to instability, and instability is obviously not sustainability. But beyond that, there is a moral dimension to this. And I would argue that, in effect, there are 3 E's in ecological economics: ecology, economics, and ethics, and that the 3 of them together provide us with the ethical framework that is the entree into the political process. I think we have the opportunity, because of the world's situation at the moment, the state of the world's economy, and I think if we're true to our statements about our concern for the ecosystem and future generations, we have a moral obligation. Thank you.